Year one of the bonding ended with both of them still alive, still functioning, and still maintaining the boundaries they'd established. The council seemed satisfied that Lyara had made acceptable match. The queen looked pleased that her political problem had resolved itself smoothly. Jacob's engineering work had expanded to include training programs for integrating human and Zhen'tar technical approaches. They'd built something functional from a transactional arrangement. Not romance, not passionate love, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and honest communication. Then things shifted in ways Jacob hadn't anticipated. It started small, Lyara asking his opinion on council matters beyond just logistics, seeking his perspective on political challenges because she valued how he analyzed problems. They started eating dinner together most evenings, not from obligation, but because the conversations were interesting. She'd talk about her day, he'd talk about his, and they'd discuss everything from technical challenges to political maneuvering to random observations about station life. Somewhere in the second year, Jacob realized he was happy, not in some overwhelming romantic sense, but in the quiet, satisfied way of someone whose life had found sustainable, comfortable rhythm. He enjoyed his work, appreciated his living situation, genuinely liked spending time with Lyara. He also realized, with some surprise, that he cared about her beyond the political arrangement. Not love exactly, not yet, maybe not ever, but genuine affection for someone whose company he valued and whose well-being mattered to him. "You look thoughtful," Lyara observed during dinner. "Technical problem." "Personal problem, actually. I'm trying to figure out when I stopped thinking about our arrangement as temporary political convenience and started thinking about it as actual partnership I value." She set down her utensil carefully. "When did you reach that realization?" "Recently. Maybe the past few months. It's been building, but I only consciously recognized it this week." "How do you feel about the realization?" "Confused, mostly. I agreed to this expecting minimal personal connection. I didn't anticipate actually caring about you beyond the contractual obligations." Lyara was quiet for a long moment. "I should tell you something as well." "Okay. I've been evaluating my emotional responses to our partnership, trying to understand why I've been more comfortable sharing parts of my life with you than I anticipated being." She met his eyes. "I think I've developed genuine affection for you. Not love as I experienced with Thuron, that remains different, but authentic care for your well-being and appreciation for who you are." Jacob felt something shift in his chest. "So we've both accidentally developed feelings beyond the original arrangement parameters." "Apparently, yes." She almost smiled. "That's unexpectedly complicated. We could ignore it, maintain the boundaries we established and pretend we're still operating under the original terms. We could, but that would require performing emotions we don't feel to maintain comfortable fiction. You've said repeatedly, you'd rather I be honest about what I'm actually experiencing." "That standard applies to me too," he acknowledged. "So what do we do?" "We could acknowledge that the relationship has evolved beyond original parameters and negotiate what that means going forward." Lyara stood, moving to sit on the couch in their common area. "I'm still not going to stop loving Thuron. That capacity remains. But I think I have additional capacity for caring about you that doesn't diminish what I felt for him." Jacob joined her on the couch. "I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I've never asked that. I know. That's part of why this feels possible. You've never demanded I choose between honoring what I lost and building something new. You've allowed both to exist simultaneously. Because they're not mutually exclusive. You can honor your past while building your present. Most people don't understand that." She looked at him directly. "You've been remarkably patient with my grief and my boundaries. Never pushing, never demanding more than I could offer, but also never withdrawing your presence. That constancy has been healing in ways I didn't expect." "I didn't do it to heal you. I did it because it seemed like the right way to honor our agreement." "I know. That's what makes it meaningful. You weren't performing healing behaviors to earn my affection. You were just treating me with consistent respect and allowing me to process everything at my own pace. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, processing the conversation and its implications. So what happens now? Jacob asked eventually. Do we modify our arrangement, maintain it as is, something in between? I'd like to try expanding it carefully, not rushing into romantic transformation, but allowing genuine affection room to develop at whatever pace feels authentic. Lyara considered, what would you want? Honestly, I'm happy with how things are now. If they develop further, great. If they stay at this level of comfortable partnership, that's also fine. I'm not looking for specific outcome, just sustainable situation that works for both of us. That's remarkably reasonable. I've had practice being reasonable about suboptimal situations. This one happens to be significantly better than suboptimal, which makes being reasonable even easier. She did smile this time. Actually smile, not just almost smile. You're quite possibly the only person who could make this arrangement work. I'm just the person who was available when your mother made the offer. Someone else might have done equally well. No, someone else would have tried to replace Thuron or erase his presence from my life. You honored him by allowing him to remain present. That's rare quality. Over the following months, their relationship continued evolving gradually. They started sharing more personal space, sitting together while working instead of isolating in separate wings, occasionally watching entertainment programs together, having longer conversations that ranged across increasingly personal topics. Lyara talked more about Thuron, but now it felt less like testing Jacob's tolerance and more like genuinely sharing important parts of her history. She told stories about their time together, explained what had made their bond meaningful, acknowledged that his death had devastated her in ways that still hadn't fully healed. Jacob listened and asked questions and never tried to diminish what she'd experienced. He shared his own stories about life before the war, his family, the technical work that had always fascinated him. They built understanding through accumulated small exchanges rather than dramatic emotional revelations. My mother asked how the arrangement is working, Lyara mentioned one evening, maybe 18 months after the bonding. What did you tell her? That it's working considerably better than expected, that you've been unexpectedly excellent partner who respects boundaries while also being genuinely present. She paused. She seemed satisfied. I think she was worried we'd barely tolerate each other. We've exceeded tolerance by substantial margin. We have. Lyara looked at him directly. I want to tell you something I haven't told anyone else. I'm listening. When I agreed to this arrangement, I was certain I'd never develop genuine feelings for anyone again. I thought that capacity had died with Thuron. But you've proven that wrong, not by replacing what I lost, but by showing me I have room for additional connection that exists alongside it. Her voice carried emotion he rarely heard from her. Thank you for being patient enough to let me discover that. You're welcome, though I should mention I wasn't being patient for strategic purposes. I was just being myself. I know. That's what makes it valuable. You weren't performing patience to earn my affection. You were genuinely accepting the relationship parameters we'd established. They sat together in the comfortable silence they'd developed, and Jacob reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. 5 years ago, he'd been a prisoner wondering if he'd ever go home. Now he was bonded to someone who genuinely cared about him, doing work he enjoyed, living a life that felt sustainable and meaningful. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It had started as purely transactional arrangement he'd accepted because the alternative was unknown. But it had become something real through accumulated small choices to honor agreements, respect boundaries, and allow connection to develop at its own pace without forcing it into predetermined shapes. The Queen's original offer, marry my widowed daughter and you're free, had been purely political calculation. She'd expected functional arrangement that solved administrative problems. What had developed was considerably more than that. not because anyone had demanded it or engineered it, but because both he and Lyara had chosen to honor the reality of their situation while remaining open to whatever it might become. That, Jacob reflected, was possibly the most profound kind of freedom, not just escape from imprisonment, but the ability to build meaningful life within constraints by accepting them honestly and working with what actually existed rather than demanding it transform into something else. Lyara had taught him that honoring loss didn't prevent building new connections. He taught her that someone could stand beside grief without trying to erase it. Together, they'd built partnership that the Queen probably hadn't imagined possible when she'd made her calculated offer. Sometimes the most important transformations came not from dramatic gestures, but from consistent small choices, to respect what someone needed even when it wasn't what you might have wanted. Humanity's strength had never been conquest or force. It was this: the ability to stand beside loss without demanding it transform, to honor grief while allowing space for new growth, to build connection through patient presence rather than aggressive pursuit. Lyara understood that now. The Queen had witnessed it developing, and Jacob had found freedom not through escaping constraints but through accepting them with enough honesty to build something meaningful within them. The first weeks established patterns that resembled functioning household without requiring actual personal connection. They ate breakfast together. Because the schedule worked that way, Lyara reviewed daily obligations while Jacob read technical journals, and they made minimal conversation beyond practical coordination. She attended council functions that required spousal presence. He accompanied her and learned to navigate Zhen'tar political dynamics through careful observation. They maintained completely separate personal lives beyond those necessary intersections. It was exactly the arrangement Lyara had described: formal partnership without emotional engagement. Jacob focused on his work. The engineering division had officially hired him as consultant now that he had legal status, and the problems they brought him were genuinely interesting. He fixed environmental systems, upgraded aging power distribution networks, occasionally got asked to explain human technical approaches to skeptical Zhen'tar engineers. One evening, about 6 weeks after the bonding, he was working on diagrams in the common area when Lyara emerged from her wing looking exhausted. She stopped when she saw him, apparently surprised he was still awake. "Technical problem?" she asked, gesturing at his displays. "Power distribution optimization. The current network has inefficiencies that compound over time. I'm trying to find a solution that doesn't require rebuilding the entire infrastructure." She moved closer, studying the diagrams. "You enjoy this work. It's satisfying to fix things that are broken. Clear problem, concrete solution, measurable improvement." He highlighted several sections. "Plus it's challenging enough to be interesting without being impossible." Thuron used to say similar things about tactical problems. She said it matter-of-factly, without emotional weight. He liked challenges that required creative solutions within defined constraints. Jacob had learned that Lyara would sometimes mention Thuron casually, testing whether it would make him uncomfortable. Early on, he'd responded with simple acknowledgement, "That makes sense," or "interesting perspective," and she'd seemed satisfied he wasn't going to react badly. Now these mentions happened occasionally without tension. "Tactical problems and engineering problems have similar structure," he offered. "Defined objectives, limited resources, need to find optimal path through constraints." He would have liked talking to you about that. Lyara sat in one of the common area chairs. Most people couldn't follow his tactical analysis. They'd nod politely, but their eyes showed incomprehension. "I get that response when I explain power distribution problems to non-engineers. People want simple answers to complex questions." "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm told you're doing well with the engineering work. The division lead mentioned you solved a cooling system problem they'd been struggling with for months." The cooling system had interesting failure pattern. Took a while to identify the root cause, but once I found it, the solution was relatively straightforward. They talked for maybe 20 minutes about technical problems and tactical thinking, and it was possibly the longest personal conversation they'd had since the bonding. Lyara eventually returned to her wing, but something had shifted slightly, a small expansion of the territory where they could interact beyond pure logistics. Over the following months, these conversations became more frequent. Lyara would ask about his work. He'd explain technical challenges. She'd sometimes share observations about council politics or mention things Thuron had said or done. Jacob learned to listen to the memories without trying to compete with them, to acknowledge Thuron's continued presence in her life without feeling threatened by it. "Why doesn't it bother you?" she asked one evening, maybe 4 months into the bonding, "when I talk about him. Because he was important to you, and pretending he wasn't doesn't serve any useful purpose. I'd rather you be honest about what you're thinking than perform emotions you don't feel to protect mine." Most would find constant mention of deceased former mate to be uncomfortable. Most probably entered their marriages with different expectations. I entered ours knowing exactly what it was, political arrangement where you'd maintain boundaries. You mentioning Thuron is part of maintaining those boundaries. That's working as designed. Lyara studied him. "You're remarkably pragmatic about this situation." "I've had practice adapting to situations I didn't choose. This one is significantly better than previous alternatives." "Better than freedom." He considered the question seriously. "Different from freedom, but not worse. I have work I enjoy, living conditions that are comfortable, and a partner who treats me with honesty even if not affection. That's more than a lot of people have. You set very low standards for personal fulfillment. I set realistic standards based on actual circumstances rather than idealized fantasies. Seems to work pretty well." She almost smiled. She'd been almost smiling more frequently lately, never quite getting there but getting closer. 6 months after the bonding, Lyara asked him to attend a memorial ceremony for Thuron. It was the anniversary of his death, and she'd maintained private observance every year since. This would be the first time she'd invited anyone to join her. "You don't have to attend," she said, "but I thought you might want to understand this part of my life. I'd be honored to attend." The ceremony was simple. Lyara placing flowers at a memorial marker in one of the station's garden sections, speaking briefly about memories and loss, standing in silence for a while. Jacob stood with her, quiet and respectful, not trying to fill the silence with empty comfort. Afterward, they walked through the gardens together. "Thank you for coming," Lyara said. "Most would have found it uncomfortable. It seemed important to you. That makes it worth being present for. Even though it acknowledges I'm grieving someone else. Especially because of that. You asked me to be part of your life as it actually exists, not some idealized version where you've conveniently stopped loving your dead husband. I'm honoring that request." Lyara stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "I need to tell you something." "Okay. When my mother first proposed this arrangement, I assumed you'd accepted for purely practical reasons. Citizenship, freedom, political advantage. I thought you'd tolerate my boundaries grudgingly while hoping I'd eventually change." She paused. "But you're not tolerating them grudgingly. You're genuinely accepting them as valid framework for our relationship." "Because they are valid. You were clear about what you needed. I agreed to those terms. Seems like I should actually honor what I agreed to. That's not how most people approach marriage. Our marriage isn't like most people's marriages. Seems reasonable to approach it differently." She was quiet for a long moment, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't quite read. "I appreciate that you respect what I need rather than what you wish I—" Lyara arrived at the meeting with an expression that suggested she was here under protest, and planned to make that clear through minimal engagement. She wore simple robes in dark colors that seemed designed to avoid attracting attention, and she moved with careful control that suggested extensive training in not revealing emotional states. The Queen had arranged a private sitting room for the introduction, neutral territory that wasn't quite formal enough to feel like political negotiation, but wasn't casual enough to be comfortable. Jacob stood as Lyara entered, then sat when she did, trying to read her reaction and getting absolutely nothing from her carefully composed features. "This is Jacob Reeves," Sela'var said. "The human I mentioned." "Jacob, my daughter Lyara." "Hello," Jacob offered, feeling inadequate. "I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting." Lyara looked at him with analytical assessment that felt clinical. "My mother believes a political bond would solve various problems. I'm here to determine whether those problems are worth solving through this particular method." "That's direct. I dislike indirect approaches to uncomfortable topics." She glanced at her mother. "May we speak privately?" Sela'var stood. "I'll be available if you need me." She departed, leaving them alone in the sitting room. Lyara was quiet for a long moment, studying him with that same analytical intensity. "You were a prisoner. For 5 years, yes. And now you're willing to bond with someone you've never met in exchange for citizenship and freedom. Your mother offered it as alternative to immediate release. I accepted because the situation is complicated enough to be interesting, and because I figured I'd at least meet you before making final decisions." "Interesting," she said it without inflection. "Most would say yes, immediately regardless of who I am. Royal family connection provides significant advantages." "I'm sure it does, but I've spent 5 years in situations I couldn't control. I'd prefer not to enter another one voluntarily, without understanding what I'm agreeing to." "What do you want to understand?" Jacob considered how to phrase this diplomatically, and decided direct matched her approach. "Why you refused all the Zhen'tar matches, what you're actually looking for in this arrangement, what boundaries you need maintained." "I refused Zhen'tar matches because they all came with expectations about replacing what I lost. They wanted me to bond again as though Thuron never existed, to move forward by forgetting rather than by honoring." Her voice remained controlled, but something shifted in her eyes. "I don't want to forget. I want whatever arrangement. I accept to acknowledge that part of me will always be bound to someone who's dead." "That seems reasonable." "Most don't find it reasonable. They find it problematic or unhealthy or politically inconvenient." She looked directly at him. "What would you expect from this bond if we proceed?" "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. Your mother framed it as political partnership that wouldn't require personal engagement beyond what you're comfortable with. That seems like low bar to meet. You'd accept formal bond without expectation of romantic attachment." "I've been a prisoner for 5 years. I've learned to accept situations that aren't ideal. Being married to someone who doesn't love me but treats me with basic respect would be significant upgrade from detention." Lyara almost smiled. "Almost. You have very low standards for relationship quality. I have realistic expectations about situations that start with 'marry my widowed daughter and you're free.' I'm not expecting romance novel. I'm expecting complicated political arrangement that might become tolerable if we're both reasonable about it." She was quiet for a while, apparently processing this. "My mother believes you're competent with technical systems and capable of working within our culture without causing incidents. I fixed a lot of broken equipment and learned to communicate effectively with engineers who didn't initially trust me. Does that count as relevant qualification? It suggests you can adapt to difficult circumstances without becoming resentful." She stood, moving to look out the windows. "I should be clear about something. I will never love you the way I loved Thuron. That capacity was exhausted when he died. If you're hoping time or patience will change that, you'll be disappointed." Jacob stood as well, moving to stand at respectful distance. "I'm not trying to replace anyone or expecting you to feel things you don't feel. I'm just trying to understand what this arrangement would actually look like. It would look like formal political partnership. We'd live in the same residence. attend necessary social functions together, present unified front for council purposes. But the personal dimensions would remain separate unless and until we both decided otherwise. So, roommates who are technically married for political convenience. Essentially, yes. She turned to look at him. Most would find that arrangement unsatisfying. Most weren't prisoners for 5 years. I've learned to find satisfaction in small improvements to bad situations. This would be significant improvement. Lyara studied him for a long moment. I'll accept the bond. But I'm establishing clear boundaries now. I will honor Thuron's memory openly. His name will remain present in my life. If you cannot tolerate that, decline now. I can tolerate that. I'd rather you honor what you lost than pretend it never existed. Why? Because pretending loss doesn't exist doesn't actually make it go away. Just makes people perform emotions they don't feel, which seems exhausting for everyone involved. Something shifted in her expression, not quite approval but maybe recognition that he'd said something she hadn't expected. We'll proceed then. I'll inform my mother. The formal bonding ceremony happened with minimal pageantry at Lyara's request. A small gathering of necessary witnesses, traditional vows modified to acknowledge the political rather than romantic nature of the bond, legal contracts establishing their respective rights and obligations. Jacob signed documents he barely understood while trying to process that he was actually doing this. Afterward, Lyara showed him to their assigned residence, a spacious apartment in the royal family section with separate private quarters for each of them and shared common areas. Your space, she said, gesturing to one wing. Mine. She indicated the opposite direction. Common areas we'll both use. I'll arrange access credentials and introduce you to relevant household staff tomorrow. This is significantly nicer than my previous quarters. I imagine most spaces are nicer than detention cells. She moved toward her private wing. I have work to complete. We'll discuss household logistics tomorrow. She disappeared into her wing, leaving Jacob standing in luxurious common area that was now apparently his home, trying to process the reality that he'd just married a woman he'd met once, and who'd made it extremely clear she would never love him. He'd chosen this. He could have taken the simple release, gone home, resumed normal life. Instead he was here, bound to a grieving widow and a political arrangement nobody seemed to think would work. It was probably the strangest decision he'd ever made. He unpacked his minimal possessions into quarters that felt absurdly large after years of confined spaces. Found the technical library access had been upgraded to include restricted materials. Discovered he actually had significant credit allocation now. The practical improvements were undeniable. He was free to move around the station, access resources, live without guards monitoring his activities. The bond had delivered everything the Queen had promised in terms of status and freedom. The personal dimensions remained to be determined. Lyara existed somewhere in the other wing, no doubt processing her own complicated feelings about this arrangement. They'd both made calculated decisions for practical reasons. Whether those decisions would prove wise remained to be seen. Jacob reviewed the bonding contract terms before sleeping. One clause caught his attention. Either party could request dissolution after 2 years if the arrangement proved truly untenable. It was an escape route built into the structure. Not immediate freedom, but eventual possibility of it if things went badly. He could work with that. 2 years wasn't so different from the 5 he'd already served, and the conditions were significantly better. Tomorrow he'd start figuring out how to actually live in this strange situation he'd chosen. 5 years feel different depending on which side of the bars you're standing on. For Jacob Reeves, 5 years as a prisoner of war meant learning the Zhen'tar language by listening to guards argue about shift rotations, understanding their culture through overheard conversations about family obligations and political scandals, and developing an unexpected talent for fixing their chronically malfunctioning environmental systems, because boredom plus engineering background plus access to broken equipment equaled something resembling purpose. The war had ended 3 years ago. Most human prisoners went home within months of the ceasefire. Jacob stayed because the Zhen'tar orbital command kept finding reasons to delay his transfer, first claiming administrative backlog, then citing security reviews, eventually just stopping with excuses entirely. His status shifted from prisoner awaiting repatriation to something more ambiguous. They moved him out of the detention block into small quarters near the engineering section, started asking his opinion on persistent technical problems, paid him in meal upgrades and access to their digital libraries. It wasn't freedom, but it was something other than imprisonment. Then one morning, 2 royal guards appeared at his quarters with expressions suggesting this wasn't a routine maintenance request. "The Queen summons you," the senior guard said in flawless human standard, which was somehow more unsettling than if she'd used Zhen'tar. "Come immediately." Jacob followed them through corridors he'd never accessed, past the functional engineering spaces into areas with actual architectural aesthetics, where walls curved with deliberate artistry and lighting created effects beyond mere illumination. They reached an anteroom outside what he assumed were the Queen's private offices. One guard gestured him to wait while she went inside. He waited, tried not to think about what possible reasons the Queen might have for summoning a human former prisoner, reviewed his recent activities for anything that might constitute a security violation, came up blank but remained anxious anyway because sudden royal summons rarely meant good news. The guard returned. "The Queen will see you now." Queen Sela'var sat behind a desk that managed to look both functional and impossibly elegant, reviewing something on multiple holographic displays. She was smaller than he'd expected. Zhen'tar royalty in media always appeared larger than life, but in person she was maybe 5'9", slender, with the silver-traced skin markings that indicated high noble lineage. She wore relatively simple robes rather than full ceremonial regalia, which somehow made her more rather than less intimidating. She dismissed the displays and looked at him directly. "Jacob Reeves, sit." He sat in the indicated chair, maintaining what he hoped was respectful posture without looking terrified. "Your Majesty, I'm honored to." "Skip the formalities. I'm told you're competent with mechanical systems and diplomatic enough to work with our engineers without creating incidents." She pulled up new information. "You've also been held here for 2 years past the repatriation deadline, which is unacceptable regardless of how useful you've made yourself." "I hadn't realized there was a specific deadline, Your Majesty." "There was. Various administrators found reasons to ignore it because you were solving problems they couldn't fix themselves." She closed the files with visible frustration. "That ends now. I'm authorizing your immediate release and transport back to human-controlled space with full diplomatic apologies for the extended detention." Jacob felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tense. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I appreciate." However, she stood, moving to look out windows overlooking the orbital station's habitation rings. "I'm also offering you an alternative to immediate departure." The tension returned immediately. "An alternative, Your Majesty? My daughter was widowed 4 years ago when her mate was killed during the final battles of the war. Since his death, she has refused all traditional bonding protocols, isolated herself from court, and declined every reasonable match proposed by the council." Sela'var turned back to face him. "Her grief is understandable, but it's become politically problematic. The council believes a new bond would help her move forward. She refuses to consider any Zhen'tar matches." Jacob had no idea where this was going, but was increasingly certain he wouldn't like the destination. "I'm sorry for her loss, Your Majesty, but I don't understand what this has to do with my release. I'm offering you a choice. Accept immediate release and return to human space as originally planned. Or accept a formal bonding contract with my daughter, which would grant you citizenship, freedom of movement within Zhen'tar space, and the political standing that comes with marrying into the royal family. He stared at her, waiting for the part where this made any kind of sense. Your Majesty, I'm a human prisoner with no political standing whatsoever. Why would you offer this? Because my daughter won't consider Zhen'tar matches, but might accept someone outside our cultural frameworks. Because a human bond would be seen as unconventional enough that it doesn't feel like replacing her deceased mate. And because you've demonstrated capacity to work effectively within our culture while maintaining your own perspective. Sela'var returned to her desk. Also, frankly, because the council is pressuring me to address her situation, and this solution satisfies their concerns while giving her choice they've been trying to eliminate. Does she know about this offer? She knows I'm exploring options. She doesn't know specifics yet. The Queen pulled up what looked like contract terms. The bonding would be formal, but the personal dimensions would be negotiable between you and her. I'm not requiring romantic attachment, just political partnership that allows her to satisfy council expectations while maintaining whatever boundaries she needs. So you're offering me freedom in exchange for marrying your widowed daughter and not demanding she actually care about me. Jacob tried to find diplomatic phrasing and failed. That's the deal. Essentially, yes. Sela'var showed no embarrassment about the transactional nature. You'd gain citizenship, freedom, and significant political standing. She'd gain acceptable match that satisfies council without requiring her to emotionally engage beyond her comfort. I'd resolve a political complication that's been consuming too much of my attention. What if she hates me? Then you'd have a politically advantageous but personally uncomfortable arrangement, which describes approximately 40% of noble marriages in Zhen'tar history. She dismissed the contract displays. I'm not claiming this is ideal solution. I'm offering it as alternative to immediate departure. Think carefully before deciding. How much time do I have to think? 3 days. If you accept, you'll meet my daughter before finalizing anything. If the incompatibility is truly impossible, we'll reconsider. But I need your preliminary decision within 3 days. Jacob returned to his quarters feeling like he'd been hit by conceptual freight train. Freedom was right there. He could leave, go home, return to his actual life after 5 years of involuntary detour. Or he could accept the most bizarre political arrangement imaginable and stay in alien space, married to a grieving widow who probably didn't want him there. The smart choice was obvious. Take the freedom. Go home. Resume normal existence. But something made him hesitate. Maybe curiosity about the daughter who'd refused all matches for 4 years. Maybe the realization that home might not exist the way he remembered after 5 years away. Maybe just the strange appeal of a situation so absurd it became almost interesting. He spent 2 days researching what he could find about the Queen's daughter. Her name was Lyara. She'd been bonded young to a military commander named Thuron who was apparently legendary. Brilliant tactician, decorated veteran, beloved by his troops. They'd been together for 8 years before his death. Public records showed she'd withdrawn completely from court life after his death, maintained only minimal contact with family, refused all social functions. The available images showed a woman with the same silver-traced markings as her mother, dark eyes that suggested intelligence and intensity, features that were objectively beautiful by either human or Zhen'tar standards. But in every image, even the ones from before Thuron's death, she looked distant, present but somehow not entirely engaged with whatever was happening around her. On the 3rd day, he requested audience with the Queen. I'll accept the bonding contract, he told her, on condition that your daughter agrees after meeting me. If she refuses, I take the standard release with no complications. Sela'var looked satisfied but not surprised. Reasonable terms. I'll arrange the meeting.